Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about a little bit of action going on with UCLA and Cal. Sounds like UCLA might owe Cal a little bit of money for leaving the Big Ten the way they did and kind of leaving their sister school in the lurch there. But let's jump into NIL a little bit more and talk about the kind of recruiting world around NIL. Every time that I've heard people talk about NIL, they're always talking about the flaws around it. And don't get me wrong, there are plenty of flaws. And one of the big things that I've heard, kids demanding money, the transfer portal leveraging that into getting more money in NIL. That's never the way it was supposed to work. I think we can all agree on that. It's definitely not what we want to see in college football. But when we talk about NIL, I've seen a ton of people make the argument whether it's, your team just lost a recruit to another big team, or just you see someone like USC or Texas or Georgia or Bama or whoever get a big time recruit, and you say, okay, so they paid the most or they outbid everyone else or whatever that looks like for you. I think that's something that sentiment has been building and building more and more as NIL has kind of gone on, and I don't think that's how it works. And I think there's a number of different reasons for that. But I think when you talk about big schools and big brands in general, they're that way for a reason. And don't get me wrong, money helps that a ton at the end of the day. But when you look at the big time schools in college football, when you look at Bama and Ohio State and Georgia and Texas and all of these teams, they're teams with history, right? They're teams with championships, with Heisman's, with moving players to the NFL, which is really what I want to uh, get on mostly, because when we talk about NIL, it's a beautiful thing for the time being, right? It's a lovely thing for, young players to be able to make a little bit of money during college, kind of bridge that gap, make everything more comfortable for them. But that's not money that you're going to live on forever. That's not a retirement fund. That's not anything that is going to get you as far as you need to go in this life. So the way you make, generational wealth is to go to the NFL. The way that you change your entire life and the life of many people coming after you in your family is by getting to the NFL. So you'd be shocked how much that is pitched over, we can offer you X amount of money in NIL. Because when you look at the recruiting battles, whether it's, one that was very interesting this past cycle was Dylan Raiola when he when he left UGA, decommitted from them and committed to Nebraska. There was a little bit of talk that Nebraska was more willing to put up that NIL money up front than Georgia was, and that's kind of come to fruition with a couple of commitments in Georgia and other big time schools, which we'll actually get to here in a minute. But it shows you the reality of this situation. There are certain teams that are pushed a little bit more to be the NIL big dogs, to pay a little bit more upfront for these players, because you need these players a little bit more. And not only that, but also you don't have necessarily the ability to pitch you'll be able to move on to the NFL and make insane amounts of money quite as much as the big dogs do. So I think when we talk about the recruiting pitches for these teams, there is a lot around NIL, and I'm not trying to say that, when you go to Georgia, you don't hear about NIL at all. You definitely do. But at the end of the day, when you go to Georgia as well, they talk about NIL, and then at the very end of it, they say, that's great and all, don't get me wrong, and we will absolutely help you do that. But that's not what you're here for. What you're here for is to move on to the NFL and make millions of dollars and be in a position where not only are you set for the time you're in the NFL, but you're set for quite a while afterwards, where the NFL has things in place like insurance for quite some time, where college football doesn't, and it's something that they likely are going to have to address in the next little bit with a players' union coming into fruition. But you also have pension that can come down the road in your retirement. You have tons of connections to other businesses and ability to kind of go out and do things and make money after your career, and a million other things that the NFL has that college football doesn't have when it comes to making money, and making money that lasts and can get you to retirement and through retirement. So it's a huge conversation in college football recruiting, where you look at Texas and you look at Georgia and you look at Bama and you say, well, they have the most money, they pay the most, and that's just kind of the way it works. I don't necessarily think that's the way it works. I think they do pay plenty of money, and they absolutely do flex their muscles in that department. But also, they don't need to quite as aggressively, at least from the outset, because you have so many other things to pitch. You have so many other ways to get kids on campus and get kids to buy into your program than waving a big check in front of their face. So I think there's this idea that, the big schools pay the most and that's why they get the best recruits. The big guys get the best recruits because they're the best teams and they're the best place to go to the NFL and to get that money. And now the NIL helps, don't get me wrong, and they definitely have the ability to flex their muscles there as well. But I do think there's this idea that NIL is the end all be all, and at some of these big time schools, that's just not how it works. And it kind of brings me back to the Brian Kelly and Dominic Williams situation that we talked about last week, and I was a little bit critical of Brian Kelly, saying, I think in general, the idea that you shouldn't be paying kids, whatever they want, you shouldn't be bending a knee to every kid that walks into your room, I think that's a good way to go about business. But I felt that the circumstances around their team, and especially at the defensive tackle position, were a little bit too dire to take that into account. I've kind of changed my tune on that, and a big reason for that is I think I was watching Josh Pate, who's someone who I think does an incredible job over at 247 Sports, and he was talking about this, and he kind of went along the same lines as me, at least from the outset, and then at the end said, you cannot let the circumstances compromise what your program is supposed to be. And I think that's something that's huge. The LSU D-line, it's not going to be great this year, period. It probably won't even be good, to be totally honest with you. But it's going to be a problem if you end up paying this kid 1.2 or 1.5, which was the reported amount, and he gets into that locker room and buries you for the rest of the year, because there's a reality where, maybe you play with a bad D-line in 2024 and it loses you 3 games, and that sucks, and you don't want to be in that position as an LSU fan. But there's also a situation where you sign Dominic Williams, you give him all that money, he walks into the locker room and everyone is looking at him side-eyed saying, why is this guy that just walked in from TCU making more money than I am, or making more money than some of the staffers are? And that's a huge thing that you can bury a year by, not taking a kid, and that's and that's whatever. You can bury your entire program by taking a kid and making that wrong decision. So I think this decision by Brian Kelly and by LSU is really just saying we believe in ourselves to not only recruit the position incredibly well throughout the next, couple of years, which is something I think they'll do really well, but also, we're not going to compromise what we do on a daily basis and what our program is and what our locker room is for one guy. And for someone who, fantastic player, Dominic Williams is going to be incredible and help out that Oklahoma team a ton. But at the end of the day, you're putting your program in a position where it could be, I guess the best way to put this, the best way to put an entire bow on this is LSU having a bad D-line this year only hurts this year. LSU compromising and giving Dominic Williams all this money could bury them as a program for the next little bit and could end Brian Kelly's era in Baton Rouge. Period. It could totally bury all of the work that he's done to set up a good culture and to set up a good infrastructure there for players to feel safe and feel comfortable. And it could turn it into a little bit of a toxic environment very, very quickly. So I think it's a decision where from the outset you say, LSU doesn't have the dudes to compete, and maybe that's true, but they could have the dudes down the road, and you could bury yourself if you allow this one instance to define your program going forward. So I just kind of wanted to touch on that a little bit more. I think it's something that, from the outset, I was a little bit critical, saying, this defensive line does not look good. And don't get me wrong, it does not. But at the end of the day, you got to make decisions in favor of your program over the team sometimes. And that's exactly what Brian Kelly did. And I think it'll pay off for him down the road. I think it'll make more sense. And I think it'll, give kids a little bit of perspective when they walk into that room where Brian Kelly's not just going to, hand you money, and you're not just going to be able to walk in that room, say, I want $1.2 million, and him say yes. So it not only, helps you in the terms of keeping that program and that locker room intact the way that you want it, but also you kind of weed out some of the guys that you don't want walking into that room, right? You weed out some of the guys that are not in it for the right reasons, or are asking for money, or are pushing. Maybe they just won't take visits to LSU because they know exactly where Brian Kelly stands, and that's a huge part of this. So when we talk about NIL and recruiting and all of this stuff, we always talk about, the big schools, and they pay insane amounts of money, and that's just the way it is, and they outbid everyone. That's not really how it goes usually. All these schools have infinite amount of things to sell before they even get to NIL, where some of these smaller schools, I don't want to name any schools in particular, but some of these smaller schools don't necessarily have that ability to pitch national championships and Heismans and draft picks and all of this different stuff that Georgia and Bama can. So I think that's the biggest kind of misconception, and plenty of big schools do use their money. I mean, we saw Ohio State this past offseason really flex their muscles in that department and bring in a remarkable recruiting class, as well as bringing back some guys that definitely could have been in the NFL right now. So it's kind of it's a fight between two things, where you have these big guys where you want to keep up in NIL and you want to be able to, flex your muscles a little bit because you have a lot of cash to throw around. But at the end of the day, you don't want to, compromise anything within your program. And also, you have just so many things to sell that you don't necessarily need to push NIL quite as much as some people might think you do. So NIL is kind of one of those big arguments and big conversations over the last little bit that it feels like everyone has the same idea. Everyone's not very happy with the way NIL works. Everyone wants it to change. Everyone wants it to get fixed. But everyone kind of has a different idea of how it's utilized in recruiting. And I think us getting on the same page as in fan bases or just in college football overall with decision makers, understanding how this actually works in the recruiting world is super vital to set up good rules and make sure that all of this is set up in a way that makes sense. So it's going to be a battle. It's going to be something that people are watching very closely, but I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing that I've seen more and more of as we've gone throughout this kind of NIL era, where it's been where Bama gets a recruit and they say, well, that's just the biggest check. It tends to not be, to be totally honest with you. But we'll see that kind of unfold over the next couple of years, and we'll see if that holds true. Ohio State kind of pulled that trigger this past offseason, so maybe some other teams follow suit and they start to do that more and more. But for the time being, it seems like the big-time schools are a little bit less willing to give up some of that money than some of the smaller schools are. But we're going to take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about spring overreactions. We're going to go into the Big 12 today, get to Utah, Kansas State, Texas Tech, and Arizona, and break down kind of what my biggest takeaways from their spring were. So stick with us, and we will be right back with that.